How's it going, everyone? We're breaking down the top decks of Pioneer. Like always, the F&M tier decks will be in the description down below. Be sure to check those out. And if you enjoyed these videos, please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. First up, we're going to start with the D tier. These are the decks that will show up to various events that you're playing in. They have the possibility to do well. They often will have very polarized matchups, but if you find the right matchups, you can still do quite well with these decks. First up, we have Blue-Red Control. This deck has come and gone since the banning of Expressive Iteration, though it still gets a lot of value out of cards like Narset Parter Avails, as well as Day's Undoing. Even though you've added Ledger Shredder, a lot of the times you're just operating like a worse Phoenix deck that can't close as quickly when you need to. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits. For a while, Mono Blue Spirits was the premier Spirit deck in the format, but we've seen a shift as a new top Spirit deck won the last 2 challenges from this weekend, but Mono Blue Spirits sits in an awkward position where the tempo game is still incredibly good against decks like Mono Green Karn, but you struggle against the efficient removal decks like Rakdos Midrange or Blue Red Phoenix, as they're able to interact 1-for-1 at mana costs equal to what you're playing, and then their spells go over the top of yours. Traditionally always tough to play tribal decks into these kind of matchups. Last up in D tier, we have Lotus Field. This is a deck that continues to oscillate, generally because of its Karn matchup. The Mono Green Karn matchup is in an awkward place where Lotus has started overloading for answers to the hate pieces. 3 Beseiju, 2 Otawara, a Blast Zone, along with removal spells in the board for things like Damping Sphere. You do also need to find a Pithing Needle to turn off the first Karn so that you're able to avoid repeated looping of the hate pieces. Lotus Field is able to deal with most of the higher tier decks, especially Blue-Eye Control, Arclight Phoenix, and Red-Black Midrange, but you do struggle against the various Spirits decks along with the aggro decks like Heroic, Mono Red, and Mono White. So you have a lot of polarized matchups, and if you hit the right way, you'll see a lot of success, along with needing to pilot the deck quite well as it has some slim margins. Next up, we're going to do the S tier, but this week, for the first time in a long time, we don't have an S tier deck. I think this somewhat reflects the fact that this week's challenges had a lot of very similarly placed decks within the tiers. A lot of the A tier decks did very similar against each other, and we're seeing a lot of rock, paper, scissors among the top decks where you might have a good matchup against 2 of the 3 other top decks, but you can't sweep them all, and these decks are starting to jostle enough that I think we see a reasonable amount of parity. There have been a lot of really strong finishes from various decks in the last couple weeks, and I think right now we're in a place where the metagame sits in a bit of parity. You can tune for various matchups, but I think what we saw this weekend was that if people overcorrect towards one deck that's sitting towards the top, the last couple weeks, Rakdos Midrange, Blue-White Control, Mono Green Karn, you'll start to see some other decks start to surprisingly pick up as the decks that attack those have some natural weaknesses as well. So we're going to go down to the A tier. We mentioned most of the decks in this tier. These are going to be the decks that consistently put up top finishes, regularly top 8, regularly top 16. They are decks you must absolutely understand how to play with and against if you want to be able to win larger scale events. We start off with Rakdos Midrange. This is the mid-range interactive deck in the format, while not going as over the top as some of the other controlling decks in the format. You're able to pivot between both playstyles of having more aggressive draws, Thoughtseize into 2-drop into 3-drop, or interacting on every turn, things like Bone Crusher Giant into Planeswalkers and various removal, keeping aggro decks from getting a lot of traction. Your biggest problem, as has been pointed out repeatedly, is that you struggle greatly against Mono Green Karn. That is the biggest matchup that even as more tools continue to come out, it is still tough to turn it into your favor. Next up, we have Mono Green Karn, which continues to be further and further from a reasonable name for this deck as we've added 3 different versions, if not including a 4th, more no splash one. You have just pure mono green, as it's been for a long time. Then you have the mono green deck splashing Bolus off of Oath of Nissa. Then we have seen the green black version pioneering Vraska Golgari Queen alongside Fatal Push as ways to interact with Heroic interact with Kiora in mirror matches, as well as use Ugin's Nexus in the sideboard to be able to get infinite turns. We've also now seen Teferi, who slows the sunset, make its way into the deck as an additional untapper that has the ability to gain infinite life, go off earlier, be able to really accelerate turn 4 kills, as well as being able to give you a variety of other options in the way you attack. This is a deck with very polarized matchups. Decks that can't get through your 4/4s will struggle into you. Decks that need to control the board or control what permanents resolve will struggle into you. Mono Green Karn, very good into red black midrange, great into blue white control, good into Abzan Greasefang. Where you're going to struggle is against decks like Bant Spirits, Mono Blue Spirits, Blue Red Phoenix, and Heroic. These are matchups you don't want to see, and they have been prevalent enough to keep the deck from reaching that S tier, where people have been pretty regularly bringing more and more tempo and aggro decks that can, either through flying or protection spells like Brave the Elements or God's Willing, get through your defenses. Next up, we have Blue-White Control. The 60-card version has become a bit more of the stock standard staple. You're able to interact reasonably against a lot of the top decks while still controlling the board against various aggro decks. You actually have a pretty strong matchup into many of the lower tier decks where you're going to struggle. Again, if you run into some of the spirit decks that can tempo you out, alongside Abzan Greasefang that can generally clear the path with some Thought Seizes and other interaction, and then combo you, leaving behind vehicles that are hard to answer. The downtick in Farewell has been something I've been noticing in the 60-card version. I think Farewell is very well positioned. It costs 6 mana, obviously is the biggest downside, but right now we're seeing a lot of decks that have non-creature permanents that matter and stay on the battlefield, as well as use the graveyard. So I'd like to see Farewells start to pick up a little bit. The deck is very good. It's able to interact with a lot of the decks in the format, though you do still suffer from a bad Mono Green Karn matchup, as well as Rakdos midrange always being a close matchup that can go either way, even if red-black feels a little favored right now on the 60-card version versus the 80. And then finally, same with Phoenix, you're going to have close matches where, depending on how you draw, how they board, whether they pivot to the Young Pyromancer build post-board, you can see various different results in that matchup. Finally, we have a bit of a jump. We have a newcomer to the A tier. It won both challenges this weekend. It's been hard carried by some devout Spirit players, and that is Bant Spirits. The deck has been slowly improving its matchups across the board just by leveraging its tempo and being able to play in a similar fashion to how Mono Blue Spirits does, but rather than leveraging actual counter spells, a lot of your permission, a lot of your ability to interact with the board sits in play, using things like Shacklegeist, Clave Apparition, Spell Queller, Selfless Spirit, and an addition that didn't initially find its way into the deck but has made a big difference is Extraction Specialist. This card has given the deck a lot of longevity against your bad matchups in Phoenix and red-black midrange, giving you the ability to, much like Mono White Humans does, grind out in that mid-game, leverage some of the value of requiring your opponent to always have an answer on time, and if they don't, you're able to start protecting your creatures and they will fall behind. Flyers are at a premium right now. Almost all of the decks in the format leverage ground battlefield superiority, so Bant Spirits gets a big advantage there where there aren't many flyers or reach blockers outside of Cavalier of Thorns. The deck has a great Mono Green Karn matchup. You are able to fight very well into blue-white control. You struggle a little bit into, again, Phoenix and red-black midrange, but with Extraction Specialist and just the general ability to come back in tempo with things like Collected Company, you've certainly seen Bant Spirits become the de facto best Spirits deck. Next up, we're going to go down to B tier. We're going to kick it off with a little bit of a surprise. The last couple of weeks, Abzan Greasefang has been notably absent. Last week, it showed up in one prelim. No challenge, top 16s, nothing. But this week, it actually put up a fantastic result, including a second and a third place finish on Saturday. The deck has been slowly rebounding, though I still think it will struggle into Mono Green Karn. You're able to beat up on blue-white control. If Bant Spirits and the various other tempo decks can't interact with you favorably, you can just sort of turn 3 combo them out, and you have a reasonable mid-game to try and fight through some of the more controlling matchups. The deck has a very high ceiling. You just have to be careful about, as people start adding getting more dedicated graveyard hate. I've been seeing some Leyline of the Voids show up in Pioneer leagues, and those are much harder for the deck to answer than the cheaper things that Witherbloom Command can hit. So this week, Abzan Fang did very well, putting up the most challenge finishes tied with Mono Green Karn. The deck certainly has some legs and is very powerful, and I'm excited to see if it can continue to adapt to fight some of the hate, or if we'll see after a strong weekend this weekend if it will drop down a bit. But my biggest concern remains with the prevalence of Mono Green Karn. Next up, we have Blue Red Phoenix, which just continues to be a solid deck in the metagame, able to continually churn, find cheap removal to deal with the aggro and spirits decks, while having a good mid to late game plan against the various mid-range and control decks. Being able to fight Mono Green Karn and the various spirits decks is a big advantage, and skilled pilots will continue to put up top results as we see week in and week out. Next up, we saw Red Black Sacrifice. This deck has been slowly coming back again with the removal of Onikul Anvil a little while ago. We've seen a more fixed package out of Red Black Sacrifice, focusing more on things like Unlucky Witness, Obnixilis, etc., being a more value-oriented churn deck that gets a lot of value out of sacrificing things, even if they don't have to recur. The deck does very well into mid to late game decks like Rakdos midrange, where 1-for-1 and value removal is at its worst. Where you're going to struggle is against Mono Green Karn. Last up in B tier, we have Boros Heroic, one of the more straightforward aggro decks of the format, able to get under a lot of the various mid-range control decks, including the decks that don't interact very much like Mono Green Karn or Abzan Greasefang, where you are potentially able to just push through your lethal damage even through their best starts. Heroic still remains in a difficult spot dealing with blue-white control, red-black midrange, and blue-red Phoenix, all decks that are able to interact reasonably with you, wrath your board either through spot removal or wrath effects, and keep you in a position where you have to have a creature stick around for a few turns. We've been seeing the additions of cards like Adanto Vanguard and other threats that are harder to answer, that are able to help you push through some of these matchups post board, but you're still looking to prey upon non-interactive decks like Mono Green Karn, or decks that might also be fighting you in an aggro sense that you can just outsize with your heroic creatures. The deck is still very strong, but does have a bit of a ceiling if the metagame stays where it is right now. Last up, we're going to talk about the C tier decks. To me, this is sort of the line between decks above C and above you want to be considering as your decks for weekend events. Generally, the higher the better, obviously, but anything from C and B tier will at least be reasonable considerations that could take down a tournament, top 8, top 16 without batting an eye. We start off with Mono White Humans, another one of the best aggro decks in the format. The prevalence of Brave the Elements is a game-winning card, especially in Mono Green Karn. Decks that are able to put up lots of blockers or make the board state a little uncomfortable have trouble being able to stop you from just building up a board state and then killing them in one swing. The power of Hopeful Initiate against a lot of the decks in the format alongside Dahlia, Dahlia's Lieutenant, Extraction Specialist, and Adeline give you lots of curve to be able to power through various decks, and Brutal Cathar is at an all-time high in the metagame where a lot of creature decks rely on one or two key threats to stem the bleeding. A timely Brutal Cathar on, say, an Old Growth Troll will often shut out the game. Next up, we have Jund Sacrifice. We've just been seeing a slight rise in this deck as Corvold is a hard-to-answer threat that's able to win the game on its own, along with leveraging the various engines similar to Red Black Sacrifice, Mayhem Devil getting a lot of value alongside just churning value with your various engines. Really, I think the biggest thing holding up Jund Sacrifice is that Corvold is an incredibly powerful card, Mayhem Devil, incredibly powerful card. Your card quality is very high, but it takes a little while for your engine to get going, and a lot of decks, especially Mono Green Karn, can leverage that slight time delay to just go over the top of you. Last up, we have Mono Red. We've been seeing various builds, a little bit more low to the ground, a lot more Mono Red Cleave to try and answer some of the top decks in the format. Mono Red, being a good deck, continues to keep things like Mono Blue Spirits in check even more. You're able to fight reasonably against a lot of the mid-range and non-interactive decks, things like Mono Green Karn, Blue-White Control. Where you're going to struggle is when you run into decks like Red Black Sacrifice, Red Black Midrange, or even some of the sacrifice decks like Jund Sacrifice, because they'll just be able to get in reasonable blocks, go over the top of you. If you can't find Ember Cleave, usually it will be tough enough for you to beat a lot of the mono green Karn starts, but this newer version of red is much happier to run into Karn than the older one, and we could see mono red continue to rise if more spirit stacks and things of that nature come into the meta. That's this week's tier list. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate you. Until next time.